nationalist not only educates the wounded egos of adults, but educates his young. We see many of our nationalist organizations concern themselves weekend after weekend with the education of grown people. And that's fine. That is a part of the education of the race and the advancement of the race. But we must recognize that we have to educate our young as well, and that the true survival of the race must couple the education of the parents with the education of the children. And nationalist organizations that concern themselves almost exclusively with the education of the adults and not the education of children is a nationalism that is incomplete. That is why you see in Marcus Garvey, you see in Elijah Muhammad, an equal education of the adult and of the children, an education of the family as a whole, and an education of individuals as well. Because a true nationalist knows that he must educate, as the word nationalism implies, what? The nation and everyone in it. When you see a nationalist organization only educating its adults, you may get a clue that you have an organization that may not be so concerned with the educating of people, but a people who are dealing in a compensatory way with their hurt pride. People who are more concerned with salvaging their own ego pains than with really advancing the interests of their people. Because it is these people then who will spend tons of money upon the salvaging of their own ego and yet rob their children of a sound education and sound development. And therefore the true nationalist sees the education of all as his destiny. The true nationalist recognizes the unity of the relationship between education and building, politics, economics, and religion. He is not just a specialist, but you'll see in the organization of Marcus Garvey, the organization of Elijah Muhammad, not just an organization that is centered around some special concern, just concerned, let us say, with jobs, or just concerned with the legal aspects of black people, or just concerned with education of black people, but an organization that is concerned with all aspects of that have to do with the advancement of black people. As I've often said, in the organization of Marcus Garvey, Elijah Muhammad, you see the advancement of a culture, not just of a political ideology, but of a full culture that concerned itself with reconstruction of the family, with the education of his children, with the development of an economic system, with ultimately the development of a nation and the development of the people. And therefore, the true nationalist then sees a unity and a relationship between things and recognizes then that all aspects that are important to the advancement of our people must be developed and spoken to and related one to the other. And that there is a unity between then economic development, social development, and psychological development. You just cannot psychologically transform a people through lectures alone, through the teaching of history alone. Those people must be concretely engaged in the gaining of their own freedom, in the construction of their own independence, in the building of their own fate. In fact, the best psychotherapy of all is the psychotherapy of constructing one's own civilization and in constructing one's own nation. The true nationalist recognizes that the necessity of building a national government and a national and an international government as well. That we ultimately must build in this country and the world over a nation and nations of African people. The true nationalist is not afraid to delegate power. You see, we have a lot of people who come into nationalism who bring in their egotistical problems with them. And we have a lot of people who think because a person spouts a nationalist ideology that they've overcome selfishness and greed and self-centeredness and pettiness and overcome ignorance and overcome fear. Not hardly, ladies and gentlemen. Not likely. Because those things still must grow and develop. I often warn people, do not fall for people merely because they project a nationalist ideology. You must look into their soul. You must look at their character and see what the character really has in it. Because it is that that determines your relationship with them and not just the statements of their ideology. Ultimately, if we are to control our destiny, as Marcus Garvey indicated, we must then control ourselves and we must then become self-governing. And a nationalism that is not talking about self-government, it is not talking about nation building, it is not constructing a national network, it is not constructing a national economic system, social and political system, is a false nationalism, ladies and gentlemen. And therefore, we've had a leadership often that while it has inspired us with this knowledge of history and knowledge of the past, and inspired us with this daring to curse the white man out, has left us bereft of a nation, and bereft of a government, and bereft of a structure. The means and the only means by which ultimately we can defend ourselves against our enemies and determine our destiny. Be not then deceived by words. We must then look at deeds. It not only motivates, the true nationalist not only motivates through language and through rhetoric and through oratory, but trains. You cannot train the people with a 2-hour lecture on Saturdays, ladies and gentlemen. You cannot train people with once a month, once a week meetings. You know, I often get people talking about, they ask me, why do we do this? Why can't we just do so and so and so? You know, and they throw their hands up in exasperation. Why do we behave in this way or that way? Can't we see? You know, you get this kind of thing here that goes on. Then you get the question, what must we do in order to do so and so and so and so? And of course, often that question is asked with the expectation that some kind of magical formula is going to be handed out. You know, just say abracadabra and things will change, you know. Make a few passes across your heart and, you know, do that and this, and it's going to change. It's not that way. You do what every other people have done. What do you think these schools are for out here, ladies and gentlemen? What do you think the colleges are here for? What do you think the various institutes are here for? They're here to train people to behave the way they are expected to behave. You don't leave it to happenstance and circumstance for your people to behave the way they should behave. You train them to behave the way they should behave. That is why you build schools. The European, the Japanese do not ask why don't their children behave this way. They train them to behave this way. They inculcate them and they send them to school when? Once a week, 2 hours on Saturday? Every day. Throughout the summer. Every evening. That's what school is about. They spend more time with their teachers and with their trainers often than with their parents. This is what you do. If you want your people to behave correctly economically, then you have to educate them economically. If you want them to behave in a family sort of way correctly, then they have to be educated to be familiar. If you want them to behave correctly in terms of self-respect toward one another, then they have to be trained to behave with respect toward one another. This is not something that comes up by accident. And institutions have to be developed and built so that this training can take place. And the greater part of their time and the time and effort of our children should be dedicated to being trained to acquire the behaviors that we need to advance our interests. But you're not going to get that behavior if you depend upon that behavior being trained into your children by your enemies, by people who need their ill behavior and maladjusted behavior to maintain their power position in life. You cannot advance the interests of your people merely by talking about our greatness for a couple of hours in the afternoon. You're going to have to teach it day in and day out and place your students and your people in a position so that they may learn how to behave and how to resolve their problems. The intelligence is something, though it is given, has to be shaped. The true nationalist leader sees to the welfare of his people. One of the things when you study the history of the Japanese and Chinese and other groups in this country, you study the history of the people who, particularly in the Japanese and Chinese, saw to it that the welfare of their people were not in the hands of other people. And when you read in the past when the Chinese and the Japanese were suffering greatly from economic oppression, how they still did not let their people go on welfare through the general system. They built their own welfare program and their own internal caring programs because they recognized that when people must beggar their enemy and when they must be supported by their enemies, then they're going to be directed by their enemies and their destiny is going to be determined by their enemies. And so consequently, if you have a nationalist leader that is not moving and designing such that the people can care for themselves and their own interests, then you're dealing with a pseudo-nationalist, not a true nationalist. And you see then in Marcus Garvey, again, a man who is building with his organization a means by which the welfare of African people could be the basis and the concern and be founded upon the work and activity of African people, not upon other people who have stolen our wealth in the first place, and now we have to beg them for a little bit of it in the second. The true African leader then rewards his people, and the approval of his people is the greatest approval he can gain. We still have people who gain their greatest sense of self through the degrees and through the so-called minor rewards given them by their enemies. And we often honor our own people to the degree that they have been given these symbols of authority by another people. We have to recognize that the true nationalist becomes the source of his own rewards and becomes the source of the approval of his own people. And it is ultimately the reward by our own and the approval of our own that is the final and the ultimate reward that we go for. Because it is through getting rewarded and approved in this way that we advance the interests of our people. The true nationalist grounds his political and social philosophy and practice on a realistic analysis of his situation and of his enemies. He is not a slavish reader of foreign sources and of other political ideologies. He does not permit his reading of Marx and Lenin and these other people to paralyze his ability to think creatively. And he must recognize that the ultimate foundation for his political activity and behavior is his own realistic analysis for himself of his situation and of his circumstances, and that his ultimate political decisions, social, economic, and otherwise, must be grounded on that knowledge, not upon a theoretical knowledge of people who belong to the enemy. Does it mean that he does not read the other people? Certainly he can read the other people. But his ultimate decision is based upon his own analysis and upon the sound knowledge of himself and who and what he is and upon his reality. The true nationalist is not a purist to the degree that he is paralyzed. You know, we have some of us, we want to be nationalists, but we also want to be so pure until the end we don't do anything. You know? We end up paralyzed. We would go into business, but that's capitalism, isn't it? So we don't go into that. And we would do this, but that's in some way related to this ideology or to the enemy ideology or something. And so you see the individual often then trying to be such a pure nationalist until he cannot engage in real practical behavior. He is so concerned about getting his hand dirty, but that he dares not do anything at all. We can see the nationalist who is so hung up in his traumas, the traumas of nationalism, the traumas of capitalism, until he dare not engage in any economic development. He sees himself as been victimized by capitalistic greed, certainly by the European, until he becomes afraid of money. He sees himself used and exploited for economic ends until he does not determine exactly where money and wealth fits within his social ideological systems. And consequently, then, we get a nationalist who is hung up waiting for African communalism to come into being or communism to come into being, who's also frightened to engage in any kind of business because that's capitalism, so he remains frozen while the other ethnic groups move into his community and takes his economic resources and unemploys his children and uses his wealth against him. Therefore, the true nationalist recognizes that in this world, while we want to be as pure as possible and we strive for perfection, it means at times, though, we have to face reality for what it is and get out of it what we can and do the best with what we got. And not let ourselves be caught up then with a Puritanism that does nothing but set us up for destruction. The true nationalist then is not caught up in indecisiveness and is not caught up in some pie in the sky dream about classless societies, but gets engaged in the true work of building and construction. The true nationalist is not afraid also to overthrow tradition when tradition is unproductive. He's not one who just gives obeisance to African tradition out of some blind ignorance. And he's not one who says, even though I revered the African past and I revered the African tradition, but that tradition can be built upon. I and my generation have something to add to that tradition. I have a right then to use the legacy of that tradition to confront the realities of my current time, to modify that tradition to see to my survival and the survival of my people. And therefore, the true nationalist does not just manipulate and threaten with tradition, but uses tradition creatively and uses it knowing that as long as that tradition is used for the advancement of black people, then it is Afrocentric tradition. The true nationalist is not afraid then to engage in productive behavior. Where one sees then nationalism, one sees construction, actual growth and development. One sees building, one sees institutional development, one sees trade and development and commerce. One sees restructuring of values, restructuring of priorities. One sees the rebuilding of relationships. One sees the reallocation of resources. And when we then, as nationalist people, say that we are carrying out the legacy of Marcus Garvey, then let us show that legacy in concrete development, institution building, and nation building. Thank you very much.